Hi, welcome to Daily Readings with Pastor Nate. Today we're on Matthew chapter 16. If you haven't already done so, please pause this video and read that in your favorite translation. As always, I'll include a link down in the description if you'd like to read it online. So please stop the video, say a quick prayer, and read that, and then resume the video. All right, here in chapter 16, we're in motion. The chapter begins with some Pharisees coming and challenging Jesus, and he decides it's time to move on. So the first part of this chapter is them setting out away from where they had been and crossing the lake again. And when they arrive in Caesarea Philippi, Jesus has this conversation with them about his identity and where he's headed in his ministry. So we're kind of moving throughout this chapter. And in the beginning, when the Pharisees come to test him, they ask for a sign. And if this seems familiar, it's because a very similar thing happened back in chapter 12, where some people come sort of demanding or asking for Jesus to provide some sort of miraculous sign for them. And here Jesus says, you cannot interpret the signs of what's going on. Basically, he's saying there are signs. They come to him asking for a miracle or demanding that he do something miraculous to prove his identity. And Jesus says, there are all kinds of signs of who I am, but you're not seeing them. You can't interpret them. And then he says, the only sign you'll get is the sign of Jonah, which he had said, like I mentioned in chapter 12. He says, the only sign you'll get is the sign of Jonah. He's talking about his own death and resurrection. But in the meantime, there are all these signs that they're missing. And I can't help but think about how often in our own lives we miss the signs that God is giving us. We go through our day and we look at things in such a limited perspective. We're just aware of the physical, the here and the now, and so often we fail to think about the God who is behind those things. Sometimes we even think, oh, that was lucky, or how fortunate that happened. What a coincidence. I bet if we were more intentional about looking for the signs of God's activity in our life, a lot of those times would stop seeming coincidental, would stop seeming lucky, and would reveal themselves to be God at work in our lives. There's an ancient practice called the daily examen. I think it was Ignatius of Loyola who wrote about it. Probably he's not the only one, but the idea was at the end of your day, every day before you go to sleep, you take a few minutes to meditate on your day, to reflect on your day, and think about all of the ways that God was at work throughout your day. And there's been times where I've practiced that for varying lengths of time. Sometimes I do it for a day or two and forget, and sometimes for long periods. But if you want to be more aware of the signs that you're not interpreting, give the daily examen a shot. Just take 5-10 minutes before you go to sleep and think back over your day and thank God for all of the different ways that he's been at work in your life throughout that day. And you know what? You'll start to see that more and more often. The things that you need to reflect on now, the things that you failed to recognize during the day when they happen now, after doing this for days or weeks or months, you'll start to recognize those things right away, and you can give thanks to God immediately as they happen. And you'll be so much more aware of how God is at work in your life because you've taken the time to learn to interpret those signs. As they get in the boat and as they move on, Jesus warns the disciples to beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. And the disciples reveal what a bunch of knuckleheads they are, right? The Pharisees can't interpret the signs of what's going on, and clearly the disciples aren't great at that either, because they start to talk about, what does he mean? He's mad at us because we didn't bring any bread. And Jesus is like, what are you talking about? Like, remember just the other day when I fed 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread? Or remember before that when I fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread? And actually, it's not really even 5,000. It's 5,000 men plus women and children. And it's not 4,000. It's 4,000 men plus women and children. Jesus is like, why would I be upset about you not having bread? The disciples have still not gotten the hang of interpreting the signs, of understanding what's going on and what God is really doing, what Jesus is really doing. And in this particular case, it feels like they should have gotten it, or at least recognize something of it because they just left because of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were testing Jesus. They're asking for a sign, and Jesus decides it's time to move on because of that. So you'd think they'd see this sort of immediacy of the connection. I guess we have the benefit of Matthew having edited this down, and it may have taken him a little bit of time to get the crowds gone and get ready, get the boats ready and head out, and maybe they forgot why they were leaving. But Jesus isn't talking about bread. He can provide bread. That's not a big deal. What he's talking about is allowing a little bit of compromise, allowing a little bit of false teaching into our faith. He says, don't let the teachings of the Pharisees creep in. And this image of yeast, a little bit of yeast, will make a whole batch of dough rise. If you ever made bread, like the amount of flour you use compared to the amount of yeast, it seems like the yeast wouldn't do anything. Or if you ever brewed like a beer or a wine or anything, you'll put gallons and gallons of liquid into this jug and you add like a teaspoon of yeast, and it seems so small, so minor. And yet that one little teaspoon of yeast will take gallons and gallons of liquid and ferment them. Or that one little teaspoon of yeast will take pounds and pounds of dough and cause it to rise. And Jesus is saying, don't compromise with the scribes and the Pharisees. Don't let little bits of their teaching creep in, because if you accept those little bits, it's going to affect the whole batch. And he's saying that specifically to his disciples about these people that they've just sort of fled from, but he's also saying it to us. It is so tempting for us to let little pieces of the culture around us in. It's so tempting to hear these teachings that seem benign. And we know that maybe they don't mesh perfectly with the gospel, but it seems so minor that it must be okay if we just kind of let it creep in. Or it seems so small that maybe we don't feel a responsibility to test it and make sure that it fits with the gospel and that it isn't contrary to what Jesus taught us. But we let these tiny little bits in that seem like they can't be a big deal. And those tiny little bits cause the whole batch to ferment, cause the whole batch to rise. We need to be careful about the teachings that we're letting in. We need to examine the teachings that we're hearing and accepting, question them. Is this consistent with the gospel? Is this consistent with what Jesus says? Is it consistent with what Peter and Paul were teaching afterwards? That's why it's important for us to pray when we read the Bible and when we do these videos and things like that. Ask God for discernment, ask God for wisdom, ask God for understanding, because we can't afford to let those little bits of false teaching in, because they really will affect the whole batch of our faith. They'll affect the whole batch of the church when we let those things creep in. And if you look at churches today, you can see example after example after example of individual churches and whole denominations where they've let these little pieces in and it's affected the whole batch. So that's Jesus' warning about the yeast. And then they arrive in Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus asks this question of the disciples: who do the people say that I am? And man, that must have seemed like a loaded question. Jesus is kind in the way that he phrases it, right? Because he starts with, who do people say that I am? And so when the disciples give wrong answers, it's not really their fault, right? It's not Matthew getting it wrong. It's not John getting it wrong. It's them offering wrong answers from other people. Well, my friend says, well, these people over here say, but they are wrong. They offer these wrong interpretations of who Jesus is. And then Peter says, you are the Christ. And as much as the disciples are knuckleheads, Peter gets it right. And Jesus says, surely this must have been revealed to you by the Father. Which to me seems kind of funny. Like, you couldn't have possibly gotten that right on your own, Peter. Surely my Father must have revealed that to you. I don't think Jesus was actually making fun of him. I think this was something that really did take divine inspiration, because Jesus was not the Messiah that people were expecting, or at least he hadn't presented himself that way yet. And when he says that he's the Messiah, when he confirms that Peter is right about him being the Christ. Those words, Christ and Messiah, it's the Greek and the Hebrew version of the same word. when he confirms that Peter is right, that he is the Messiah, that instantly affects the way that his disciples see him or see his upcoming ministry. And we'll see that play out in a minute. But the expectation was that the Messiah would set up a kingdom, that he was going to be a military ruler, that he was going to push the Roman government out and reestablish the throne of David. And Jesus had done none of those things. So as much as I like to laugh about it, and it's possible that Jesus is kind of making fun of Peter for being wrong so often, I think really what he's saying is that God must have revealed this to you, because it certainly wasn't plain or obvious. Either way, Peter is right. Jesus is the anointed one. Jesus is the Messiah, the one who has been promised, the one who is coming, the one through whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed, the one who brings salvation, but also the one who will bring judgment one day. There's a lot involved there, but it's an important declaration, and one that we need to arrive to also. It's not enough for us to have all of these wrong answers that the disciples started with, right? It's easy for us to fall into this heresy, this wrong belief that Jesus was a great teacher or that Jesus was a moral influence. He is a great teacher. He is a perfect example of morality, but he is the Messiah. He is the promised one. And we need to recognize that also. We can't stop at he's a prophet, because if he's only a prophet, he's not capable. He doesn't have the authority to do the things that he did or to say the things that he did. He doesn't have the authority over our lives that he actually has. If we stop at he's a prophet, we have to recognize him for who he is in order to really have a right relationship with him. But once Peter makes this connection, once Peter makes this confession, you are the Christ, then Jesus begins to talk with his disciples about where his ministry is headed and the reality that he's headed towards the cross. And Peter goes right back to being wrong about things. He assumes that he knows what the Messiah is going to do, what the Messiah does, who the Messiah is, and he kind of chastises Jesus, says, "No, none of this can happen. You can't be executed." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." He rebukes Peter pretty harshly for having the arrogance to tell Jesus who he is. And that rebuke is available for us as well. Jesus isn't here to say it to our face, but we can't hold on to our own ideas about who Jesus is or about what Jesus is going to do or has done. Jesus is going to do what Jesus is going to do, and who are we to tell Jesus what he's going to do or who he is or what he has to do? It's up to Jesus what he's going to do, and it's up to us to choose to follow. And after he rebukes Peter, he turns to his disciples and says, if you want to be my follower, if you're going to be with me, you have to deny yourself daily and take up your cross. And when he said that, there was nothing metaphorical about it. Today, people use that term, take up your cross, to mean so many different things. It could mean carrying some kind of burden emotionally. It could mean some kind of physical problem, whether it's a health issue or a disability. And we talk about so many things as carrying our crosses. And when Jesus said it, he meant an actual wooden cross. And that's how the disciples would have heard it, because there was no metaphorical sense back then. And he says, what can a man give for his soul? What cost is too great to pay for our soul? And the answer is there is no cost. Even if it means our death, even if it means following Jesus to crucifixion, there is no cost too great for our soul. If we want to hold on to our life, we're going to lose it at the judgment. But if we're ready to lose our life following the Messiah, if we're ready to lose our life serving the Lord, then we gain it. Then we become a part of this gift that we can't afford and don't deserve, and we win our souls. I'm out of time. I hope this was an informative and meaningful time for you. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like it, feel free to share it, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And as always, if you have questions or comments, you can leave them here or on the Facebook group. Have a blessed day, and I'll see you tomorrow for Matthew chapter 17.